back to Lesson 6-2. Today we'll be talking about Acts of the Apostles, and in particular, St. Paul. We saw that the church was getting very popular in Jerusalem, and after the stoning of St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, many Christians felt unsafe in Jerusalem, and they would flee to cities that were nearby. Leading this charge against the Christians was Saul of Tarsus, a young and upcoming Pharisee who was making a name for himself by going after Christians. Interesting fact about Saul was he was born in Tarsus, which was a port city, and because of that, he was well acquainted with people from many different cultures. He studied the Greek poets and philosophers, but mainly, as a Jew, he studied the law and prophets from the Old Testament. Something that he had that most Jews didn't have was Roman citizenship. This would come in handy for Saul later in his life when he became a Christian and was being arrested by the Romans. Because of his citizenship, he had certain rights that other Jewish people simply didn't have. It's uncertain how he obtained Roman citizenship, but it is thought that his parents did something great for the Roman government. At the time, one of the greatest rabbis was Rabbi Gamaliel, whom Saul studied under. Saul had a disagreement with Gamaliel. Gamaliel does feature in the New Testament, and he says something quite wise. Confronted with the problem of these Christians, Rabbi Gamaliel said that violence should not be used. He argued that if these Christians were not a movement from God, then they would fizzle out. They would just go away. But if these Christians were doing something from God, then Jews shouldn't be found fighting against them. Saul disagreed with this opinion of Gamaliel and made it a point to go after, arrest, and hopefully prosecute Christians. However, because of his studies under Rabbi Gamaliel and at home, Saul's knowledge of Judaism, of the Jewish faith, was quite large, and his other exposure to Greek literature made him a well-rounded intellectual force. Furthermore, his religious zeal, his devotion to the law of Moses, earned him respect from Jewish authorities who would give him authority to go and capture Christians. That is why Acts of the Apostles said Saul laid waste or brought utter destruction to the church. However, Saul's zeal for God's law made his heart receptive to messages from God himself. So, the story is, hearing that Christians fled from Jerusalem to go to Damascus for safety, Paul sets out to capture them. On the way, Saul tells the tale where he sees a light that blinds him, and then he hears the voice coming from the light. "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Saul responds to this voice, "Who are you, Lord, that I am persecuting?" And the voice comes back, "I am Jesus." When Saul, or now Paul, reaches Damascus, he is now blind, disoriented, and he now is a Christian. He believes in Jesus. This is why I have used the name Paul here. Saul, when he became a Christian, chose to use his Roman name, Paul, instead of his Jewish name, Saul. We're not certain on why he chose to do this, but many point out that Paul, St. Paul, desired to preach a gospel to the Gentiles, and so he decided to use his Gentile name. That when Paul reached Damascus, he was now a believer in Jesus because he had seen him. A Christian in Damascus was given a message by the Holy Spirit to go and baptize Paul or Saul. When Paul or Saul is baptized, this is 3 days after he was blinded by Christ, he regains his sight after his baptism. This 3 days in darkness is symbolic and similar to the 3 days that Jesus was dead before his resurrection. When Paul reaches Damascus, he begins to preach in the synagogues where Jews met to worship. And Paul's preaching there was that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Old Testament and that he is now a Christian. Now, most Jews there would be very confused about why Paul, whom I'm sure they knew from reputation was a persecutor of Christians, is now preaching Christ. Maybe they thought he was only pretending so as to gain the trust of Christians, then to backstab them and bring them in prison. Christians also were confused. They didn't know what to make of it. Is he being authentic, or is he just trying to capture them? Paul tells us that he retreated to Arabia to study for 2 or 3 years. You could imagine how difficult it must have been for him. Everything he believed in has now changed and shifted to a dramatic way. So he had to go and study and make sense of his new Christian faith. He reread the Old Testament in light of his new belief in Jesus and came to an understanding of how the Old Testament predicted Jesus. When he finishes his studies, he returns to Jerusalem and meets with the 12 apostles. He describes that he preached to them his understanding of the gospel and that they gave Paul their right hand of fellowship, basically saying, you understand the message of Jesus Christ correctly. You are free to go and preach. And that is exactly what Paul does for the rest of his life, resulting in his death. As I stated earlier, one of Paul's personal missions was to preach the gospel to non-Jewish people, or Gentiles. And when they became Christians, there developed a problem for Jewish Christians. They were confused about some of the laws of Moses and how to follow them. In particular, the question was, should these Gentiles be circumcised and follow the law of Moses before they're baptized? Basically, should we make these Gentiles become Jews first and then Christians? To answer this, God sent a vision to Peter. Peter had a vision on top of a roof, and the vision is strange, so I'll try and describe it. Peter saw a sheet, like a dinner table sheet, and on or in the sheet were all kinds of animals, both clean animals and unclean animals. Clean, meaning animals you could sacrifice and eat. Unclean animals were animals you could not sacrifice and you could not eat. God tells Peter, kill and eat these animals. Peter replies, no, Lord, you know that I have never eaten an unclean animal. And the voice of the Lord comes back to Peter. What I have made clean, do not call unclean. Now, it takes this vision 3 times before Peter understands it, meaning Peter saw this same sign 3 different times. And then Peter finally understood that God wasn't just speaking about animals here. The animals were representative of people. The clean animals were the Jews, and the unclean animals were the Gentiles. So what Peter realizes is God has made the unclean, the Gentiles, clean. They are allowed to become Christians. After this vision, Peter is sent by the Holy Spirit to Cornelius, the first Gentile to be baptized, and he baptizes him and his family. However, the question of whether Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses was still something that a lot of people were confused about. So, with this question about whether Gentiles need to follow the law of Moses in mind, the apostles decided to hold the first council. With this as an example, the Catholic Church has held many ecumenical councils, meaning all the bishops of the world come together in order to discuss and put a decision on some question that's bothering them. The question at Jerusalem was whether or not Gentile Christians needed to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses. The final decision was that they did not. The wording of this council suggested that the authority came from the Holy Spirit. They said, it seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay these burdens upon you. Meaning that the decision of this council didn't just speak from their own for mankind. It also spoke with the authority of the Holy Spirit himself, proving what Jesus had told the apostles earlier. Whoever listens to you, listens to me. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.